Hello, it's so lovely to be here.
It's so great to see you, Fiona. I am a huge fan, and we got to talk about Elmet when it was out. Everything seems like forever ago. But
Yeah, I remember it was it was memorable. Yeah.
yes, so I was so excited to be able to talk to you about your second book, Hot Stew, which just like exceeded my expectations. You're going to read a section for us, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna read from the beginning. So I guess it doesn't really need much introduction because it's the beginning. It's supposed to do the job of introducing the book. But yeah, it's set in Soho in central London. So I'll just dive right in. On the corner of the street, there is an old French restaurant with red and white checkered tablecloths. The sable has been there for decades and has changed very little in that time. It has served the same dishes with ingredients sourced from the same suppliers and wines from the same vineyards. The bottles are stacked on the same shelves, and when they are pulled out and dusted off, the silky liquid is poured into the same set of glasses or ones of a similar style, bought sporadically to replace those that smashed. The plates are the same, small, round porcelain. When the weather is good, tables are placed outside. There is a space between the public thoroughfare and the exterior wall, and the tables are set tightly with two chairs tucked beneath. One of the tables wobbles. Over the years, thousands of napkins have been folded and placed under the offending leg. Hundreds of customers have complained and moved to alternatives, and thousands more have quietly put up with the inconvenience. They have spilled glasses of wine, grumbled, and considered asking to move before deciding against it. The restaurant serves escargot. The restaurant has served escargot since it opened. Hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of snails. They have been thrown into boiling water and their carcasses scooped out and served with garlic butter. The chewy pellets have been picked with forks and fingers and the curled shells discarded. It is lunchtime in midsummer. A box of snails has been taken from the fridge and placed on the side, its contents ready to be immersed and scalded. It is left unsupervised as chefs bustle around the kitchen with sharp knives, pots and pans, bunches of parsley and stalks of celery. A single snail, on the small side, wakes from its chilly slumber and climbs over the edge of the box, down the side, and onto the stainless steel counter. Slowly, it descends to the floor, then to the back of the kitchen, where there is a door to the street. After about 20 minutes, the little snail finds itself in the alley behind the restaurant, feasting on the discarded leaves of a Savoy cabbage. Once sated, it continues its journey. It begins to climb the wall, flexing and releasing. The building stands in Soho, in the middle of London. The foundations were constructed in the 17th century during the interregnum, in the space between a father and a son, the ampersand between the king is dead and long live the king. Bricks and plaster overlaid onto a now crooked timber frame. There were wormholes in the timber and snail licks on the bricks. The district was once a suburb. London was enclosed by a wall, and to the north there was a moor. There were deer and boar and hare. Northwest of London, northeast of Westminster. Men and women galloped out from the two cities to hunt, and their cries gave this place its name. So ho, so ho. The stone came. Bricks and mortar replaced trees. People replaced deer. Sticky grey grime replaced sticky brown dirt. Paths carved by the tread of animals were set in stone, widened, edged with walls and gates. Mansions were built for high society. There was dancing, gambling, sex. Music was played and plays were staged. Bargains were struck, sedition was plotted, betrayals were planned, secrets were kept. New people arrived. Emigres from France came to escape revolution, guillotine, war. Mansions were divided and subdivided. Drawing rooms became workshops, parlours became coffee shops. Whole families lived in single rooms and disease spread. Syphilis erupted in sores on the skin and delusions in the mind. Cholera hid in the water, crept through the drains, came out of pumps and down human throats. Books were written, ripped up, rewritten. Karl Marx dreamed of utopia while his wife cooked dinner and scrubbed the floor. His friends met on Great Windmill Street, where wind was once the means of production. When the bombs fell on London, Soho took a few. Dark lesions appeared in the lines of Georgian townhouses, and people sheltered beneath ground. After the war, the concrete came, and parallel lines, and precise angles that connected earth to sky. Houses were rebuilt, shops were rebuilt, and new paving stones were laid. The dead were buried, the past was buried. There were new kinds of men and new kinds of women. There was art and music and miniskirts and sharp haircuts to match the skyline. Films were made, records were cut. Soho came to be filled with the apparatus of sound and vision. Electric currents ran through cables and magnets and copper coils and pushed rhythmic air into dark rooms where people danced in new ways and drank and smoked and ingested new drugs imported from old places, and they spoke again of revolution. And they spoke until the winds changed. Trade and commerce and common sense and common decency prevailed, and men and women availed themselves of all opportunities. New roads were laid, office blocks shot up, and luxury flats stood on crumbling slums like shining false teeth on rotten gums. Thanks. That's from Hot Stew.
It's such a good opening. I feel like it really encapsulates so much of what I love about this book, which, even though it is very, it's completely modern, but it feels so drenched in the history of this place. So yeah, let's talk about it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, this feels like a book that is very much about gentrification and capitalism, but you have woven in so many different adjacent issues. You talk about addiction, we're talking about sex work. Can you talk about how all of these threads came to be and basically how the story started for you?
Yeah, so I think it is about gentrification, capitalism, all of those things. It's about bodies and relationships between people. And I guess I am interested in those things as a writer, and I'm certainly interested in dealing with those kind of political topics. But the reason that it's a novel and not a non-fiction book, or not a not piece of journalism, is because I like those issues to be explored through characters and through human relationships and through circumstances and chance encounters. The book started, I guess I had the idea when I was about 25, and it was the summer of 2013, and I was living in Soho in central London for 4 months. I had a room in an old 17th century townhouse, and I was on the top floor. And it would have ordinarily been way out of my price range. But I had a friend of a friend who knew that it was being rented out for cheap because a new tube line was being dug underneath, and the whole building was shaking, and the whole thing was uninhabitable and kind of on the brink of collapse, and there was scaffolding up one side to prop it up. But the owners thought they'd make a quick buck by renting it out to people gullible enough to live in a place that was about to fall down. And that person was me, age 25, thinking, okay, how often do you get the chance to live in, a historic district of central London at a rent you could afford? So I jumped at the chance, and it was during those 4 months before I got kicked out by the council that I came up with the idea for this novel. And I suppose I got to know the district quite well. I sat around kind of chatting to people, watching people. Novelists are total busybodies, and I'm just the same. I was at that time writing my first book, Elmet, or I just started it a few months previously. So I sat in my attic room writing about rural Yorkshire, and sort of at the back of my mind ticking away was this thought that, okay, when I'm done with Elmet, when I'm done with rural Yorkshire, that kind of scene, I'm gonna try and write about Soho. It was ticking away, and then I started it in 2016. So that was a long answer, but that's how it came to be.
We're here to hear you, so yeah. Don't edit. So basically, I was curious because I know it's funny, you mentioned, you're always pleased that people in the US want to read your books, but can you tell us a bit, just about like Soho, because I
Yeah,
think it is
of course.
really it's a relatable concept, but at some point someone mentions like I didn't know anyone lived in Soho, so I was thinking
Hmm.
about what it's like over there.
Yeah, so it's not to be confused with Soho in Manhattan. It's different, but yeah, it's in the centre of London, and I guess it started being built in like the 16th century. It was before that; it was fields, and it was the place where people from London would go and hang their laundry. And they'd go and graze their cattle and things like that. And then, of course, cities develop, cities change. So people started building on it. And as people started building on it, it kind of became this party district. And it's changed a lot over the centuries, but it's always retained this sort of this nightlife scene, and it's home to a lot of London's theatres. So when we talk about the West End, just as you guys talk about Broadway, we mean Soho really. The West End is Soho. So if a play is really big, it goes to the West End. And yeah, it's full of nightclubs. It's also historically one of the homes of London's gay scene. So there were underground gay bars there before male homosexuality was legalized in 1967. So it pre-existed that, and it's also red light district traditionally. So there are these walk-ups where women sell sex, and so it's got a huge mix of people. It's also a place where there are a lot of film studios, a lot of really famous records were made there from very well-known British bands from the 60s and 70s. So yeah, it's not a place where a lot of people live, but it's a place where some people live, because it's, well, for various reasons. There are some very wealthy people who live there. There are some people who just kind of really like living in the center of things and are willing to spend all of their money on rent to live there. And then there are also some council flats. So that would be, I don't know what you guys would call that, but it's traditionally housing for people of low incomes.
Okay.
So there aren't many of those left in places like Soho, because it's such prime real estate, but there's still still some in central London.
So the heart of the novel, for me at least, is are these two sex workers who are based in the building that's at the center of this, a wealthy, can't think of the word, developer wants to knock it down and basically force them out. Mm-hmm. So Tabitha and Precious, they're kind of fighting for their building for themselves and against just this trend of wiping out the less wealthy. How did you decide that sex workers were going to be at the core of this story?
It kind of happened over time. So I knew that I wanted this to have a lot of voices, and that was partly because my first novel, Elmet, was first person narrator. There was just one voice in that. And I knew that I wanted a cacophony, and also because I wanted to set it in the heart of the city. I wanted there to be a real crowd of characters, and there are over 20 characters, over 20 significant characters, and I wanted to include everybody from all walks of life, people of all backgrounds and professions, and from that basis, there were some characters that just slowly and kind of organically emerged as leading voices. So Precious and Tabitha actually started out as relatively minor characters. I had this idea of having the building being under threat from developers and people taking the lead, and that really sort of became a more central theme. I mean, so in the last kind of decade or so, there have been large scale evictions of some of Soho's sex workers. So that is something that was happening, and there are real world resistance movements organised by sex workers, and they've been very successful in their endeavours, and they've written about their struggles themselves. You can find it on a website called the English Collective of Prostitutes. They've been organising themselves for decades now. So if you want those kind of real world voices, I really urge you to seek those out. But yeah, this was is obviously completely fictionalized, and but I guess, yeah, because that was going on, I thought, wow, this is quite something. And yeah, Precious and Tabitha came to the fore as strong voices in the book.
What was it like researching or just inhabiting so many distinct voices, and they do feel really distinct from each other, but also living in very various different ways that are not necessarily relatable to the person reading it, perhaps to the person writing it. And I feel like that's such a hot topic, about writing, what you're allowed to write about and what not allowed, but taking on other, doing due diligence, in telling someone else's story. And I'm curious how you navigated that, especially with sex work and addiction being such fraught topics.
Yeah. So I guess I really wanted to write from the perspective of lots of different people, and I clearly I'm aware of those conversations, and I think they're very important conversations, and I think there's sometimes conversations where that kind of there is a certain degree of bad faith when people are representing other people's perspectives on that conversation. But yeah, I just didn't want to cause any sort of harm to some of the more vulnerable characters in the book. I suppose I wanted to write about these characters from sort of a place of humanity, and I wanted to I wanted to grapple with some serious themes, but I wanted each of the characters to have their own sense of agency, their own sense of purpose. And I suppose, from my perspective as a writer, I concentrated on the things that I felt I was able to grapple with, either from, empathy or conversation or reading or all of the things that we do as writers and human beings to try and understand each other. And when we read of a character in a book, when we read a character, we only ever see snapshots, we only ever see snippets, we never see the whole, we never see a fully fleshed out person, because it's art, it's fiction. We only ever see them from certain angles, and I suppose I was aware that there were only certain angles that I could present as a writer, and only certain things that I could understand as a writer. And so I tried to touch upon those things that I felt I was able to grapple with, and step away from some of the things that I didn't feel able to grapple with. And yeah, as I was writing, I was realizing that I was stepping my toes in lots of different issues, in different territory that people feel people feel strongly about, and I suppose I just really felt that I had to write the book that I wanted to write. And if there was criticism of the nature of along the lines of who are you to write this, that I would listen to those perspectives and try and learn from those perspectives, and try and see try and make my mind up whether I did the right thing, or whether the book addresses those issues sensitively. I never wanted to kind of I never wanted to step back from the edge of those topics. I wanted to plunge right in and be ready for the pushback, because pushback is part of the conversation. Criticism is how we learn to be better writers. It's how we learn to be better people. So it's about taking those kind of ideas and using them to to improve your work, I think.
Yeah,
that's kind of
that's
how I approached it. Yeah.
That's such an interesting, fantastic answer. I've never thought about that in that way of like, you're not going to be able to tell this full picture regardless. So touching on the things that you feel like you can relate to. It's funny because I think, having listened to this conversation, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, they might be surprised that it's actually quite funny also. Like, there's, you know, there's a playfulness to the book. And I do want to talk about that. So something that I thought about while reading is the strength of this omniscient narrator, and the energy of that, like, rolling. I have described it as like passing a baton from one character to the next, to the energy of this. And it was reminiscent of me, to me, of Dickens. And I don't know if that's something you were thinking about. I feel like specifically Bleak House, especially, that sense of community and these, you know, kind of larger than life characters, a little bit surreal. Was that something you were thinking about at all?
Yeah, I mean, I find it difficult to write about London without thinking of Dickens. I think he kind of inhabits all London novels, for better or worse. I'm a huge fan of Dickens. And yeah, I was definitely reading a lot of 19th century novels when I was writing this, Dickens, but also Anthony Trollope, also George Eliot, who's really you know, just the greatest writer that's ever lived. But especially Dickens, because Dickens is so surreal. You know, people use the word social realism, of course, but really, there's so much in Dickens that is fantastical, that is surreal, unreal, hyper real. And I wanted to experiment with all of those things. And so yes, there's a lot that happens in this novel which is downright bizarre, and I I just wanted to kind of draw out the sort of the more outlandish elements of living in the centre of a city, and people, you know, coming across each other and bumping into each other and living cheek by jowl or on top of each other. And I also wanted this novel to wear its artifice on its sleeve, and this partly relates to the question before. You know, I wanted it to be very obviously fictive, very obviously staged, artificial, slightly fake, actually. You know, Soho is a place of fakery. It's a place of theatres and films and, you know, cinema and dance and people pretending to be all sorts of things. That's what it's about. So I wanted it to be, yeah, gaudy and larger than life, and yeah, just that sort of that uncanny sense of something which is sort of social realism, but actually, you know, that actually a lot more cartoonish and caricatured. So yeah, I was thinking about Dickens, and I'm also glad that you mentioned it was funny. This has been a serious conversation, hasn't it? But yeah, I really wanted to crack some jokes this time, because Elmet, in my first novel, it's many things, but it's not funny. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to really try something a little bit different.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so, as you know, this is our selection for this month for the BuzzFeed Book Club, and I was excited about it specifically for that, because I tend to pick quite dark books, because that's like what I read, and I was just so taken in immediately by it's like there's a sprightliness to it, to counteract these really serious, you know, these serious issues that are really complicated and have real effects on so many people in the world. And so balancing that the way you did, it just makes it's such a unique voice, and I feel like quite a departure from Elmet. How do you feel about the two in conversation with each other?
Yeah, it's a huge departure. I mean, in a way, I was a bit worried for my publishers, because I mean, it's not my job to market my book. It's kind of their job. So, but I worried that they would have a really tough time trying to persuade people who enjoyed Elmet that they might enjoy this as well, because they're so different. You know, it's not a given that if you liked Elmet, you'll like this. But equally, if Elmet wasn't your thing, then this might be, because yeah, it's funny and light-hearted and ribald, and Elmet was pretty dark. That said, sometimes I think of it as the same book in different clothes, because at the centre of both novels is a dispute over a piece of land. In Elmet, it's a dispute over a little woodland in Yorkshire, and in Hot Stew, it's a dispute over prime real estate. But it's got the same kind of engine, even if it's, you know, kind of dressed up in a totally different chassis, I suppose, if we're going to extend that metaphor. Yeah.
So is there, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that, because I did think of the fact that home, the idea of place and home and property, is featured in both. Is there something about that that feels really fruitful for you, or just there's a lot to say there? What draws you to that theme?
Yeah, it seems to be, I mean, it seems to be something that a lot of people of my generation are really grappling with. You know, I suppose you'll see this in New York City as well, of course, but a lot of people are really struggling to kind of put down roots in places, because rents are so high, the cost of living is so expensive. So it means that, yeah, people are kind of struggling to build communities and stay in places for a long time. But that was one of the reasons. But I'm also interested in the homes that we create for ourselves and the families that we create for ourselves. So I think this is particularly true of queer communities, and there are a lot of queer characters in this novel. You know, people who maybe don't have the best time with their own family tend to set up new families, and they do so in places in cities. So I wanted to explore that. I wanted to investigate what it means to call a place home, and what you're willing to do when that home is taken away from you, or when somebody's trying to push you out. I think it's these pieces of property that are in both Elmet and in Hot Stew interest me, because they're places that sort of nourish people emotionally, places where people build families, but then also it's property, so money is a factor, and there's the forces of capitalism that are kind of alienating people from their homes. So yeah, it was a kind of ripe topic of discussion, I suppose, in the novel.
You mentioned the queer characters and kind of found family, and I know I mentioned them before, but Tabitha and Precious, their relationship is so beautiful and so unlike a relationship that I've seen, broadly in mainstream media. Because it's not romantic, but it's certainly loving, and I'm curious about that relationship, but also in general, just which characters really spoke to you and you were really excited to write about.
Yeah, so Tabitha and Precious have this kind of relationship which they resolutely refuse to define. And I was I suppose I was messing with people a little bit with it, because I really wanted people to make their own minds up about what was going on there. They're friends, but they're also life partners. There's no sense that they're gonna go off with other people, or live apart from each other. They live together, they sleep in the same bed. They are attached to each other. Tabitha knits clothes for Precious's granddaughter. They're totally a unit, but it's not romantic. It's not a straightforwardly romantic relationship, like between either a man or a woman, or two women or two men who are romantically involved. And I suppose I wanted to write that because it's something that I see. I see either between, I have friends who are just thinking of one one's a gay man and one's a straight woman, and they have lived together for 20 years, and that will always be, and they have boyfriends and girlfriends, but they are the core unit. And I know I know other people who live in that way. So it's something I wanted to explore, because I think we're very, very interested in romantic relationships as a society, be they gay or straight. But we're not as interested in those kind of really, really profound friendships. So yeah, I suppose I liked those as characters, but I also wanted to explore people like Lorenzo. So Lorenzo is a bisexual man who is an actor, and he gets a role in a TV show where he has to do all sorts of kind of horrible things. He plays a really, really nasty character, and so he finds himself living this kind of inhabiting this nasty figure, and it kind of makes him think about, I don't know, what it is that he's doing and what it is that he's contributing to the world, and why he became an actor at all. And then I also wanted, because there are so many different types of desire in the book and different types of relationship, I also wanted a kind of very normative, straight down the line boy-girl romance, and that's, I suppose, Bastien and Laura. So Bastien has a girlfriend called Rebecca, but it's not really a very loving relationship. Rebecca's not the nicest person. And so he spends the novel trying to reconnect with an old flame, Laura. And I suppose, yeah, I wanted this kind of him to just really, really fancy this girl, and for it to take him down an unexpected path. So he's a really, really privileged guy. He's kind of very English, old money. He could only exist in England, I think. And his desire for Laura just forces him to start looking around at other situations, other people, and he kind of changes his mind about the world a little bit. He starts to realize that not everyone is as fortunate as him. So yeah, he has a slightly unexpected path, I suppose.
It's interesting you say there's so many types of desire in this book, which is such a good way of describing just their motivations and what they're thinking about in this central fight. And what strikes me is that I feel like this book could have been like 1,000 pages easily, so I'd like
it
to get
was.
well, yeah, I was curious. I mean, there's so much there, and really rich characters. What was it like editing this? What was it like figuring out, because it's in pretty specific, discrete sections of time?
Yeah, so it's set in 4 parts, and it's over the course of a year. And I didn't want to be really, really specific about the dates. It's a little bit vague, but it's basically midsummer, and then the equinox, and midwinter, and then the spring equinox, because I wanted those sort of 4 quarters of the year, partly because they're it's the way that the old financial city of London used to divide the year. So it's kind of, again, got this historical aspect. So we just see snapshots, and I spent a lot of time writing things that were happening in between those moments, and then trying to take those out and just stick to the 4 days, because it's the kind of novel that could have become sprawling. As I mentioned earlier, I was reading a lot of 19th century novels at the time, and those writers didn't bat an eyelid at churning out 1,000 pages.
Right.
But I just wanted it to be much shorter than that, and I worked with my editor, Becky Walsh at John Murray in London, to really hone in on which were the important characters and which were the important moments. But yeah, I mean, it was at one point about twice the length that it is now. But yeah, it needed cutting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that being the case. There's just so much there. I would love to, and just a reminder too, because we are getting to the point where if you guys have questions, use the Q&A thing. We'll be going through them towards the end. Just a reminder. But I'd love to talk about the history that you do refer to a lot. And yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that could have been told without. So when that happens, I'm always wondering, what was your decision to say that, I'm even from the very beginning saying this is where the city came from, and you need to know that to hear the rest of the story.
Yeah, it was really important to emphasize that this district used to be fields, and that it's had this long history of development, and it's prospered and then it's declined, and it's prospered and it's declined, and it's always been a place where there are parties, but it's also been a place where there have been a lot of immigrants, which I mentioned in that opening. So there are a lot of French refugees fleeing after the French Revolution and the Revolutionary Wars. And then in the 19th century, there were immigrants from all over Europe. And I mentioned Karl Marx because Karl Marx was a Jewish immigrant from Germany who settled in Soho for a while. So he was like, living, doing a lot of his writing just, on the next street from where this is pretty much set. So I just couldn't help but include that because so much of the book is about, capitalism.
Right.
Yeah, so it's got this really, really, really rich history. It's also a place where the real life Casanova spent a lot of time. So he was kind of doing his thing in Soho for a while. It's a place where there have been always lots of artists, 20th century artists like Francis Bacon, but also people like Joshua Reynolds. So it was always important to have that aspect. And also I really, really love that it's a place where the people from London used to hang out their laundry. Before there were buildings and before there were streets, is where people would go to do their laundry, because in a way that's what's going on in Hot Stew. It's a process of money laundering, or it's a process of cleaning up the business. So Agatha Howard, this developer, inherited her money from her father, who was pretty much a gangster who bought it up after the Second World War when property was cheap. He ran all sorts of shady businesses, and she's trying to gentrify herself. She's trying to clean up the business. She's trying to move in rarefied circles. And part of that is, making sure that the old tenants get kicked out and bringing in a new clientele. And that is, it's laundry, isn't it? It's this constant sort of circulation of capital to slowly clean it up. Whether it was dirty in the previous generation or whether it was dirty, 10 generations ago, in the case of some of the other characters like Bastian. It's this constant circulation that's required, so that everybody forgets where this money originally came from. I love the laundry aspect of Soho's past.
That's so interesting and something I would not have put together. I found it interesting that there's a theme of monarchy and royalty, and here Tabitha, is really interested in Tudors and can't believe that Precious hasn't read. I have it the right way, right? Has never heard of them. And Agatha's mother, was drawn to the fact that this was supposed to be a French king, and I'm curious, if that was anything significant for you, anything you were purposefully wanting to weave in, just the relationship with that level of wealth and prosperity.
Yeah, I suppose I really want to, so Agatha has an obsession with the French Revolution and the Ancien Regime, and she collects antiques from that era, and also souvenirs from the guillotine. So early on we see her speaking to an antiques dealer who's trying to sell her an old handkerchief that's been dipped in the blood of someone who's got the chop. So she's really, really obsessed with this, and it's because she's terrified of this happening again. She's very aware that she has a lot of money, and she's named her yacht Versailles. So there are all sorts of sort of silly little things like that. but yeah, she's really terrified that it'll happen again. She's terrified that society will slowly fall apart. So I was interested in exploring this idea of revolution from the perspective of the super rich. You know, just to wonder what, you know, if they think about these things, or, you know, what they think about. And yeah, that we see the kind of ways, the changing fortunes that have been brought about by these historical events. So Agatha's mother is from Russia, and she, you know, she left Russia after the Soviet Union started to fall down, and there was changing fortunes, and then of course that evokes the changing fortunes of the 1917 revolution. And I suppose because so much of it is about changing fortunes, the kind of, as I mentioned before, the sort of the constant circulation of capital, I wanted to just mention that all these sort of fallen dynasties, and mention this kind of, yeah, this constant circulation, and just to sort of connect this new money that Agatha has, and this old money that other people in Britain or Europe have. You know, it's a very European thing, I suppose. Yeah, so Anastasia, Agatha's mother, meets this guy in the south of France who claims to be the French king, and this is actually something that exists. There were two pretenders to the French throne. So obviously France hasn't had a king for a very long time, but there are two guys in real life who claim to be the King of France, and I just love that as a thought, you know, that you just swan around and you just like, oh, I'm the King of
trust
France.
Me.
Yeah, I'm the King of France. Okay, yeah. Well, you're not though.
Right.
Yeah, so it was another kind of like absurd touch.
Yeah. No, and I love it too, because it really emphasizes like there is nothing new. Like all of this is so cyclical, you know, the revolution, exactly. And then coming back to this in different forms, but at the core, this fight between, you know, the haves and the have-nots, or, you know, the wealth gap. I do have a couple questions, so we can get into those. Faith is wondering, are you working on a novel set in Edinburgh
now? No, I'm not. Thank you for the question. So yeah, I moved to Edinburgh a couple of years ago with my partner, who works at the university here. It is such a literary city. So some of my favourite writers, like Muriel Spark, is from Edinburgh. Other 19th century novelists like Sir Walter Scott, who's, you know, nowhere near as good as Dickens, but you know, still all right. So yeah, it's a very very literary city, and it's a kind of gothic place, surrounded in, again, history and you know, beautiful natural surroundings. But no, I'm not. I don't have plans to do that at the moment. My current interests are actually in non-fiction. I'm trying to put together a sort of a non-fiction work on Arthur Arianna and the sort of legends of King Arthur from the Middle Ages to the present day, including Hollywood and Japanese manga and things like that. So that's kind of my that's my current project. Yeah, no, not Edinburgh though.
That's your background, right? You studied medieval.
Yeah, I studied medieval history and literature, and I sort of did a bit of a PhD on it as well. But yeah, no, I'm trying to work out a way of writing up some of that research in a way that is, you know, for a general audience. So yeah, to try and draw people into that world, and it'll hopefully have it'll be non-fiction. There'll be elements of criticism, some history, but also some more kind of creative elements as well, to kind of think about questions of nations and nationhood. You know, you guys might have heard, but we're really in flux over here in the UK. You know, all of the sort of all of the different constituent elements of the UK are really sort of having a reckoning about what their identities are, I suppose. So yeah, looking at something like The Legend of King Arthur, which has this sort of these darker nationalist undertones, as well as actually very expansive kind of internationalist stuff in the original form. Yeah, it's something that I'm interested in exploring.
That's so exciting.
Yeah.
That sounds fascinating.
Good. I kind of feel like I don't know. I'm not sure anyone will have any interest in it. But I'm just trying to work that out, trying to work out if I can do that sort of engaging creative nonfiction thing. I'm not sure yet.
I love like a hyper focus when you can tell the author is just this is their thing, and it sounds like this is your thing. So yeah, sounds great. Melanie is wondering, could you talk a little bit about the underground world of London that you explore with the character of Cheryl without giving too much away?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that question, Melanie. I loved writing that bit. So yeah, I really wanted the London I portrayed to have lots of layers. So it's a multi-story building, but also it goes deep down. Because London has this extensive underground network. And a lot of people, sort of, there's this tendency to dig deep into the ground. So in New York, you kind of go high above ground, and in London, it goes, for whatever reason, goes the other way. So one of the characters takes a detour on her sort of way through Soho, and she just goes down a massive hole. So yeah, there's this underground element. I suppose I was sort of thinking of Persephone a little bit when I wrote that, the legend of Persephone in the underworld. I wanted it to be a kind of transformative process for her, but I wanted us to question whether she's better or worse off after the experience. But I don't want to give too much away, of course, for the people who've not read it. But yeah, somebody has a kind of surreal, fantastical experience in an underground lair.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
I'd love to know, like, because you say you lived in London and you lived in Soho. Do you miss it, especially now talking so much about it? How do you feel like going from that city life to where you are now?
Yeah, well, I left London because I couldn't afford to put down roots. So, I had this last hurrah in Soho, as I mentioned at the beginning of this event. And, I could afford it in the sense that I had a job. So this isn't a sob story there. I was fine. But I couldn't afford to put down roots there, or I felt I couldn't. So I returned to my hometown of York, and then I've now found myself in Edinburgh. And yes, I do miss London. London is one of the best cities I've ever been to. It's definitely Britain's only kind of truly global city. We've got other really fun cities, but London's something else, and it's in a different league. That said, I really love living in Edinburgh, the capital city of Scotland, and visiting London every now and then. So it's not far on the train. It's less than 5 hours on the train, because this is a small country. So yeah, I really miss London, but I enjoy visiting it rather than living there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, that's how I feel about Manhattan.
Yeah.
Jody is wondering, what do you read when you're deep in writing?
Oh gosh, I find it very difficult to read contemporary fiction because I get too distracted by what I'm reading, and I have this tendency to mimic, which is a bit unfortunate if you're trying to create something. So I read, well, as I said, when I wrote this, I read a lot of 19th century novels, because they're removed enough from contemporary fiction and from what I'm trying to do. I also read a lot of nonfiction, and I read a lot of short stories. So I like collections of short stories. I also take The New Yorker because it's a publication that takes short fiction seriously. I also read Granta, which is a British magazine which has a lot of short fiction in it. And I read a bit of poetry, but I'm very ignorant when it comes to poetry. But I've got a few friends that try to steer me in the right direction. Yeah.
This is, I know, putting on the spot, and forgive me, but have you read anything recently that you really loved, or anything that really sticks out?
Yeah, I read, so there's a book by actually an Edinburgh-based writer, although she's Canadian, called Sarah Bernstein. And her novel, The Coming Bad Days, is set in Edinburgh, and is really, really wonderful. It's about this sort of sense of impending doom, and about living in late capitalism. Once again, the theme returns, and it's just exquisitely written. And she's a real kind of intellect, I suppose, but also it's fun to read and very interesting.
Was that The Coming Bad Days?
The Coming Bad Days, yeah.
And one last question from Jody also. Thank you, Jody. Can you talk about how you chose your POV narrative voice for the book?
So how I chose the point of view character. So my voice as a narrator, or
I mean, yeah. Well, this is tricky because obviously there are so many characters. I mean, I would say like even just the style of doing omniscient.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So So my sort of narrative voice as an author in the book, I always wanted it to be kind of slightly pompous and grandiose. I guess because, you know, as I mentioned, I wanted this sort of artificial feel to the whole thing. And it just kind of went into this slightly lurid style. And then I wanted to make the characters discreet by varying the chapters that really focused in on certain characters. So I wanted the language to change quite a bit, the writing to change. For certain characters, it's more casual. You know, the sentences are more casual. It has a more of a you know, a spoken feel. And then for other characters who are either larger than life or sort of less casual as people, it goes into a more formal style again. I don't know if I've achieved that, because I can't, you know, read my own work and view it objectively. You know, I can't read the book and say, oh, okay, yeah, I hear this different voice, because I've been with it from day one. You know, so that's why you have to rely on a good set of editors. But that's what I tried. You know, I wanted to subtly vary the tone from character to character, but not so much that it, you know, it's not first person, so I didn't want to go all the way into that. But I wanted to do this third person thing where I just slightly tweaked the prose a bit.
Yeah, I think that comes through. I mean, and I think that's something that I really enjoy too, was the pompous is a good word for it, because it is a very slight, it just feels, you know, like reminiscent of you know, 19th century, that kind of literature too. So yeah. This feels like a good place to stop. We're just right about the end. This was so great. I loved talking to you. I love hearing about this book, which is so wonderful. I hope everyone here buys it and reads it. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been so nice to talk to you, Arianna.
You too.
Thank you both. It's a great book. I know people are rushing to buy it right now. It's great to have you both, and good night, everyone.